As any student of history will know, the rule of Joseph Stalin resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. Many of Stalin's victims were, of course, ordinary people sent to the Gulag by figures like Nikolai and Lavrentiy Beria, but several million others also died of starvation. While it's generally accepted that the famines of the 1930s were intentional, perhaps even genocidal, it's less well known that Stalin's agricultural policies were directly informed by the unscientific, some would even say crazy, theories of one man, Trofimov Lysenko. A scientist who rose from almost complete obscurity in the 1920s to a position of absolute power in Soviet science by the 1940s, Lysenko's influence was so great, in fact, that the journalist Sam Kean asserted that he probably killed more human beings than any individual scientist in history. So, who exactly was Trofimov Lysenko? What were his theories, and how did he get himself into such a position of power in the first place? I'm your host David, and today we are going to explore the pseudoscience of Lysenkoism. This is the Cold War. Trofimov Lysenko's story begins in Poltava, in what is now modern-day Ukraine, in the late 19th century. Born on September 17, 1898, Lysenko grew up in a fairly well-to-do peasant family in what was an otherwise impoverished corner of the Russian Empire. Presumably, working on the farm as a peasant inspired him to pursue agriculture. Though Lysenko did not learn to write until the age of 13, he studied horticulture at school before entering the Kiev Agricultural Institute in 1922 and graduated with a degree in agronomy in 1925. The period during which Lysenko came of age was a period marked by obsession with modernity and progress in the arts and sciences. Scientists like Charles Darwin and Gregor Mendel, for example, had made huge strides in the study of genetics in the 19th century. Darwin, on the one hand, had developed a theory of evolution known as natural selection, in which members of species with the strongest traits survived and passed those down to their offspring, otherwise known as survival of the fittest. On the other hand, Mendel's experiments with pea plants showed that the traits Darwin described were passed down through genes. Though genes can be affected by random mutations, in general they are passed on unchanged from parent to offspring. However, beneficial traits establish themselves over generations as they're passed down to more and more members of that species. This is, of course, admittedly an incredible simplification. These two theories, in effect, establish the foundational principles of modern biology. Now, during the same period, a French scientist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had developed his own theory of evolution called inheritance of acquired characteristics. In short, this theory proposed that a species could somehow pass on characteristics acquired during its lifetime directly to its offspring. Applied to plants and agriculture, Lamarck's theory implied that, for example, if you exposed a crop like wheat to extreme temperatures in 1 year, the following year the wheat would be able to grow in that cold temperature without issues. By contrast, Darwin and Mendel's ideas asserted that beneficial changes to a plant species could be propagated through natural selection and plant breeding over time. Growing up as a budding biologist in late Imperial Russia and then the early USSR, these were the two theories that dominated Lysenko's early academic life. After graduating in 1925, he went to work in Azerbaijan with the renowned Soviet agronomist Nikolai Vavilov, where he experimented with a process called vernalization. This involved exposing crops to extreme temperatures and moisture to help them survive the harsh Russian winters. His experiments were based on Lamarck's theories and the belief that you could directly influence the physiology of a species using environmental factors. Vavilov himself had done experiments on converting winter wheat into spring wheat and vice versa, but the pair found little luck. By the mid-1920s, it was clear that Lamarck's theories were incorrect, and he had been largely discredited. Now, nevertheless, whether or not Lysenko's experiments were actually useful quickly became irrelevant. Let us consider the bigger picture in the early 1920s. As we have explored in several previous videos, the Bolsheviks envisioned communism and Marxism as paths to completely new types of society. In practice, this usually meant interrogating every existing form of knowledge to assess its compatibility with the collective principles of Marxism, as well as attempts to seize the reins of supposedly naturally occurring phenomena. Darwinism, closely related to Mendelian genetics, was one such theory. After Darwin's theories were published, several sociologists joined and brought forward the idea of so-called social Darwinism, which applied Darwin's principles of survival of the fittest to people and societies. The fundamental question for the Bolsheviks was, could a theory that put such emphasis on individuality and unpredictable events be compatible with a cohesive collective society? The answer, unsurprisingly, was a resounding no. The denunciation of social Darwinism amongst Bolsheviks, however, did not necessarily mean that Darwin and Mendel's scientifically proven theories of biology also had to be discredited. But then a quite specific set of historical circumstances came to be. The first was the rise of Joseph Stalin to a position of unchallenged power. This brought with it a hitherto unprecedentedly orthodox and hardline interpretation of Marxist ideology. The second, as historians William Dejong-Lambert and Nikolai Krementsov outline, was the series of crises the Soviet Union faced in the 1920s. The launching of the ambitious First Five-Year Plan, crash industrialization, the forced collectivization of peasantry, and extensive militarization led to a horrific agricultural crisis and widespread famine. The state thus needed a radical solution to its problems, but it also needed one which fit into Marxist ideology. Needless to say, the opportunity this unique set of circumstances posed was not lost on the humble, yet opportunistic peasant from Poltava. In the late 1920s, Lysenko started claiming that he had discovered a method to fertilize fields without using fertilizers or minerals. He then claimed that he had trained peas to grow in winter, garnering him attention in a Pravda article which cited that his work was turning barren fields of the Transcaucasus green in winter so that cattle will not perish from poor feeding and the peasant Turk will live through the winter without trembling for tomorrow. This of course drew attention in Communist Party circles. When Lysenko then asserted the possibility of growing orange trees in Siberia, they only became more intrigued. Was Lysenko the savior from famine that the Soviet Union needed? Well, the thing is, Lysenko did not read credible biological research, nor did he use standard scientific methods for his experiments. This made his early work effectively impossible to disprove. With this, the work of Lysenko and other Lamarckian scientists quickly gained the attention of Stalin as the Vozhd sought solutions to collectivization. Inspired by Lysenko's theories, Stalin forced farmers in the kolkhozy to plant seeds very close together in the belief that plants from the same class never competed with each other. He also forbade the use of fertilizers and pesticides. The 163-fold increase in farmland cultivated using Lysenkoist methods resulted in a huge drop in food production, contributing to 7 million deaths across the USSR by 1933. Consequently, Lysenko was widely ridiculed outside the Soviet Union, with one British biologist stating that he was, quote, completely ignorant of the elementary principles of genetics and plant physiology. To talk to Lysenko was like trying to explain differential calculus to a man who did not know his 12 times table. Still, despite the evident shortcomings of Lysenko's methods, none of them really mattered. Why? Well, Lysenko parroted the party line, and his peasant background made him the perfect figurehead for Stalin's increasingly totalitarian interpretation of Marxism. For example, Lysenko stated publicly that there was no class struggle between the same species, and that, quote, nobody knows what a species is, and everything written in books is not true, effectively denouncing Mendelian genetics entirely. Vadim Birstein concurs, explaining that Soviet leaders appreciated Lysenko's denial of the existence of genes as the basis of inheritance and of species as the basis of evolution. It was much easier for them to understand Lysenko's simplified anthropomorphic ideas that individuals within a species help each other and inherit changes from environmental conditions. Lysenko's peasant background and dizzying successes thus earned him the moniker the Barefoot Scientist, as well as the opportunity to conduct a speech at the 17th Communist Party Congress in 1934. In 1935, he gave another speech in front of Stalin himself, arguing that his opponents were no better than the peasants who resisted collectivization. Further, he suggested that anyone who disagreed with his theories was an opponent of Marxism. In response, Stalin stood and applauded, shouting, "Bravo, Comrade Lysenko, bravo!" As Lysenko's speech alludes, though, the ideas of a man who claimed that you could transform durum wheat into bread wheat, the agricultural equivalent of suggesting you could teach a lion to give birth to a domestic house cat, did not go unchallenged by the scientific community. Indeed, the Soviet Union had arguably the best genetics community in the world prior to the 1930s. Among its most renowned figures were Nikolai Koltsov, a Russian biologist and pioneer of modern genetics, as well as the aforementioned Nikolai Vavilov, with whom Lysenko had worked in Azerbaijan. Unlike Lysenko, Vavilov did actually accept that Lamarckism was bogus and was all too aware of the dangers posed by Lysenko's bizarre refusal to accept this. Vavilov was particularly respected. In 1929, he had formed and led the All-Union Academy of Agricultural Scientists, or VASNIL, which remained the most important agricultural research institute in the USSR right up until its dissolution in 1991. Nevertheless, as Stalin's terror picked up in the late 20s and early 30s, scientists like Koltsov and Vavilov were increasingly denounced as opponents of Marxism. Such opponents of the state's doctrine were either arrested, fired, or had their research institutes closed. As Birstein summarizes, from the 1920s to the 1950s, one needed to have courage to withstand the ideological pressure of the Soviet state and to retain one's scientific and human beliefs. Biologists could be punished for two crimes: non-acceptance of Lysenko's doctrine and protests against the arrests of colleagues. The second was especially dangerous. Both of these so-called crimes are exactly what scientists like Koltsov and Vavilov went on to commit. They fought hard to defend colleagues who had been removed from their posts, but by the late 1930s found themselves at the heart of a tragically futile ideological battle for the future of Soviet science. Vavilov was removed from his post as president of VASNIL in 1935, and by 1937, Lysenko had been installed as its head. Jerry Coyne explains that this effectively made him the dictator of Soviet agriculture and genetics. Now wielding enormous influence, Lysenko and his allies published a series of articles denouncing Koltsov and Vavilov, with Koltsov singled out as a fascist at the 1937 annual session of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the institution that sat above VASNIL. 2 years later, in 1939, Koltsov was nominated by the biology branch of the Academy of Sciences to become a full member. The day before the election, however, he found himself the subject of a Pravda article entitled "Pseudoscientists Should Not Be Members of the Academy of Scientists." Ultimately, Lysenko and his ally Nikolai were elected instead, granting them even more institutional power. In 1940, Koltsov died of a supposed heart attack, although he was likely poisoned. Vavilov was arrested by the NKVD and sent to prison, where he would die in 1943. The reason for his arrest? According to the warrant, pushing forward hostile theories, Vavilov is fighting against the theory and work of Lysenko, which has crucial importance for agriculture in the USSR. Over the course of Stalin's rule, at least 3,000 other mainstream biologists would meet similar fates to Vavilov and Koltsov. Lysenkoism seemingly had won. But Lysenko was not done just yet. Though his meteoric rise stalled over the course of the Great Patriotic War, the burgeoning Cold War created even more opportunities for him simply because he opposed the Western approach to genetics. His magnum opus was perhaps his performance at VASNIL in July 1948, where, with Stalin's permission, Lysenko held a week-long session. His keynote speech, entitled "On the Situation in Biological Science," was published in Pravda a few days later. 300,000 copies of the address were printed and distributed across the USSR, with the propaganda campaign culminating in the Soviet government stating that Lysenkoism was the only correct theory and that genetics was bourgeois pseudoscience. The American biologist and writer Stephen Jay Gould later described this announcement as the most chilling passage in all of the literature of 20th century science. Still, newly communist states in Europe and then in Asia, namely Bulgaria, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and eventually China, implemented Lysenkoist agricultural policies across the board undeterred. Up to this point, it's hard to argue that Lysenko's improbable rise was anything other than an accident of history. The man simply found himself in the right place at the right time over and over again. But like so many who stumbled into success, his time at the very top did not last long. Indeed, as is often the case in Soviet history, it was unsurprisingly the death of Stalin, and counterintuitively, the same Cold War that had enshrined Lysenko's hegemony that begun to turn the tides against him. As Dejong-Lambert and Krementsov explain, quote, ironically, the very same Cold War that had driven the officially sanctioned banishment of genetics in the Soviet Union made possible its revival just a few years later. The newly discovered importance of genetics in the age of atomic weapons and space exploration helped Soviet geneticists build a new institutional basis outside of Lysenko's administrative reach, under the protective umbrella of physics and chemistry research establishments involved in the Soviet nuclear and space programs. Stalin's death in March 1953 and subsequent de-Stalinization initiated by his successor Nikita Khrushchev greatly facilitated their efforts. Now, spoiler alert, Lysenkoism remained the Soviet Union's official agricultural doctrine well into the 1960s. But within months of Stalin's death, scientists were already bombarding party officials with letters and manuscripts outlining how Lysenko had destroyed their research fields. 2 years later, in 1955, almost 300 scientists signed a petition to the Central Committee citing similar grievances. As a result, Lysenko finally lost his position as president of Vasnil in 1956, though he did retain his membership in the Academy of Sciences. Khrushchev did briefly reinstate Lysenko as president of Vasnil in 1961 amid his campaign to master the Virgin Lands, but he lost his post again in 1962. The real end of Lysenko's career would not come until 1964, when one of his key disciples, Nikolai, was put forward for full membership in the Academy of Sciences. Among those present at the assembly for Nujdin's election was a young physicist by the name of Andrei Sakarov. Yes, that's right, the Nobel Peace Prize winning Andrei Sakarov, who had worked on the Soviet atomic weapons program before becoming a dissident against the state in the 1970s. In a remarkable departure from protocol, Sakarov stood up and said in front of the assembly, quote, together with academician Lysenko, he, Nujdin, is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and of genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudoscientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for the defamation, firing, arrest, even death of many genuine scientists. I urge you to vote against Nujdin. In response, Lysenko argued back that people like Sakarov should be locked up and put on trial. But it was no use. The times had changed. Needless to say, Nujdin was not elected, and though Khrushchev was not happy either, he was ousted in a coup led by Leonid Brezhnev just a few months later. Following the events surrounding Nujdin's election and Brezhnev's coup, Lysenko was discharged from all his administrative positions, though he was allowed to operate a small laboratory on the outskirts of Moscow. And despite a fall almost as dramatic as his rise, he remained a full member of Vasnil and the Soviet Academy of Sciences for the rest of his life. But to say nobody took him seriously would be an understatement. He pestered party officials with complaints about his persecution, even occasionally turning up at academy meetings, but was widely, and rightly, ridiculed. On November 20th, 1976, Lysenko passed away to little fanfare before being buried at the Kuntsevo Cemetery in Moscow. The absurdity had finally come to an end. So how do we summarize the legacy and impacts of Lysenkoism? Starting with the Soviet scientific community, there is a strong argument that it never really recovered. Birstein, for example, argues that the introduction of Lysenkoism as the party line in biology and biomedicine caused a selection of persons without moral integrity in these fields. Moreover, almost all Lysenkoists and their supporters kept their positions even after the fall of Lysenko in 1964 and 65. Those real scientists who lost their jobs because they rejected Lysenkoism never had the opportunity to realize their scientific talents and potential. And what about Sam Keene's suggestion at the beginning of the video that Lysenko probably killed more people than any other scientist in history? Well, knowing what we know now, it's hard to argue with this. His theories directly informed the famines that took place under Stalin, while his ruthlessness also resulted in the deaths and imprisonment of thousands of former colleagues. If nothing else, though, the Lysenko affair provides the perfect case study for those interested in just how harmful the obfuscation of facts in pursuit of ideology can be. Certainly food for thought here in 2025. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button before it is denounced by the other bell buttons for its adherence to the scientific method and the demands for verifiable evidence. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.